Algunas generaciones atrás, la humanidad creía tener todas las respuestas. La intensa búsqueda de la verdad incentivó la exploración, traspasando las fronteras de lo desconocido. Descubrimos el valor de la opinión y el pensamiento libre. Entendimos la importancia del buen manejo de la información. Descubrimos soluciones tecnológicas a las cambiantes necesidades industriales, sociales y económicas. Esta búsqueda es posible gracias a la perseverancia de mentes incansables, y su éxito depende de mantener vivo el deseo de un mejor mañana. No es solo lo que haces por ti, es lo que haces por el futuro. Universidad Pontificia Bolivariana.
El mundo puede detenerse. Tus sueños no. Elige bien. Elige UPB.
Welcome to another session of Keynote Speeches. Good morning, everyone. Today we have a very special guest who comes from the United States. She's Dr. Mabel Eliana. She's originally from Bucaramanga and an alumni from Universidad Industrial de Santander in Licenciatura en Idiomas and the specialization in English language teaching. Dr. Lamprea lives in the United States since 2005, where she has taught Spanish as a world language, Spanish heritage, and her favorite class for English for speakers of other languages, Esol. She holds a master's in educational leadership from Virginia Commonwealth University and a doctorate of education in curriculum and instruction from Gardner-Webb University. Dr. Lamprea is an Esol teacher at Charles Colgan High School in Manassas, Virginia, where she also serves as the Equity Committee Lead and the Cultural and Responsive Educator Care Lead. In her free time, she enjoys sleeping, hiking, and listening to audiobooks and podcasts. Today, she has a very interesting talk about courageous leadership in post-pandemic education. So let's welcome Dr. Mabel Eliana Lamprea to our keynote speeches.
Thank you. Thank you for having me, Monica.
Okay, you're very welcome. We are very glad to have you here, Mabel.
Okay, thank you. Well, should I share my presentation now?
I think so, yes.
Okay, awesome. So, good morning, everybody. I would like to speak a little bit about what equity, cultural responsive teaching and learning, and courageous leadership could be now in the post-pandemic education settings. The objectives of this session are, first of all, to explore the concept of educational equity. Secondly, to revise elements of cultural responsive teaching and learning. And finally, to identify actions that we can do as educators in a way of courageous leadership. So let's start with a reflection. There has been obviously many comments about what is going on with the pandemic now. In the post-pandemic times, we have been talking about a lot about the damages, but what are the positive effects of the pandemic, especially in education? I wish I could see the chat. I really cannot do it. But if you have any comments, Monica, can you please let me know if there are any comments about what positive effects has had the pandemic on in education? If there are anyone any effect. Why do you say that? If there is any response in the chat, please let me know. Meanwhile, I will start with my information. I will tell you a little bit of my journey as an educator in the United States. As Monica said, my family and I moved to the US. In 2005, I worked for 14 years in North Carolina in a very rural area. The first 10 years, I worked at a middle school that was an inner city school. So let me explain this a little bit. In the inner parts of the city, it's not like in Bucaramanga. In the inner parts of the city, we find the higher poverty levels and the higher social issues in different kinds of things like gangs or drugs and these kinds of difficulties, lots of young people raising kids or little kids living with grandparents, of course, domestic violence, etc. Right? So I worked at this school for a while, for 10 years actually, and I learned a lot. I grew up in Barrio Girardot, and of course I know what it is to be. I mean, actually, my kindergarten classmates were the OGs, the original gangsters in the town, los rasguños. So they here face the same situations we face in different ways because there are differences in culture and, of course, traditions and many other things. But in general, I came from the ghetto or the hood to work at the ghetto or the hood. The biggest difference is that most of the students were African American students. So I taught Spanish there, and I also taught ESL. That's the name that is received in this class receives in North Carolina. And that is English as a second language. So I had students from different countries, mostly Arabic and African kids at that school. And I fell in love with them. So I decided to not teach Spanish anymore. And after 10 years, I could transfer to a high school where most of my students were Latinos, first generation Latinos. It means that they were born here from immigrant parents. And the social conditions of these students were very special. At that school, I met lots of kids who are unaccompanied minors. It means they cross the Mexican border, Mexico-United States border by themselves, being minors. And they had their own particular situations. So my experience with them was that most of these kids dropped out of school. And I always wonder why, if they are so resilient, if they are warriors, if they are survivors, why are they not this kind of resilient people at school? Because if we look at the numbers, statistics in the United States, one out of, now I forgot the number, I think it's 10% of the students are English learners or multilingual learners. And it's very interesting how these students are still the lowest performing kids at school. They have the lowest graduation rates here. So I was wondering about it. So to To show you part of my journey specifically, I'm going to show you what I decided to research for my doctoral program, for my doctorate in curriculum and instruction. So this is the graph of kind of like my conclusions. Again, the question was, how can I help multilingual learners or English learners develop academic resilience since they are already resilient? What can I do? If you look at the gray part here, that's what I found from another researcher. When you work on a doctoral program, you basically use what other people have already done, to make it bigger and better. So my research was on creating professional learning opportunities for Esol teachers. Esol is the acronym that is used in Virginia, and it's English for speakers of other languages. And so creating opportunities for their teachers to help the kids become more academic resilient. And the thing is that if you look at this gentleman who did this is Dr. Morales. He created the resilience cycle, which is this one. He interviewed 50 minority students. When we talk about minority in the United States, we talk about people of color, basically, which is Latinos, people from other nationalities, African Americans, Pacific people, from the Pacific islands. It depends on the location of the schools that we have different kinds of population. In my case, my school is located about 45 minutes from Washington, D.C., the U.S. capital. And so we receive kids from all different nationalities. I think we have about 30 different languages there. We don't have a lot of students compared to the population of the school, but we do have a huge diversity of students. And unfortunately, the lowest performing kids at my school are Latinos and English learners in most of the areas. So this gentleman, Dr. Morales, he interviewed 50 minority kids who were at college already. He wanted to identify what made them to be able to go to college, because again, minority kids are not really the biggest number of learners at the universities. So in that case, and I'm not trying to talk a little bit about talk much or about Colombia, because really I have been here for, this is my 17th year here, so I don't really know what's going on in Colombia. But when I think about minority kids, I think about in Colombia, I think about because the situation here is more descriptive if we talk about race and socioeconomics. In our case, as Colombians, is more about socioeconomic status, right? So if we talk about estratos 1, 2, 3, maybe, who are the kids who don't pursue a professional preparation, right? So anyway, he interviewed these people, these students, and he ended creating this cycle here. And when I saw this, I was like, that's the answer. The answer is this. He looked at all the elements that these kids took into account to be successful academically, but the center of it was emotional intelligence. What is the problem that my English learners have to really interact well at school? One of the issues, of course, is schooling. Many of these kids come from very poor or impoverished areas where they, of course, were not able to be at school for many years or regularly. Some of these kids live with families who follow the products that are produced here, of course, in the United States. So they come from area to area to work on the lands or the fields. Emotional intelligence, that was the key. So I was like, okay, now what about Esol teachers dealing with this topic? We don't have that preparation. We are not prepared to really deal with kids, especially when we do have our own trauma, and we're challenged, we are triggered by students' trauma, especially if we are formed and we have worked as professionals using our traditional point of view of education. Anyway, this is the whole thing that I found. I added the preparation for the educators, and I translated these different elements into practices for the classroom. When I found this, the emotional intelligence as the key element of what's going on with the students, and I was finishing my dissertation, I was just basically working on the final steps of it. The pandemic came, and it was interesting because suddenly social emotional learning and emotional intelligence became the key in all this traumatic situation for everybody. So the blue part is what I did. I created the curriculum for professional learning for educators, that specifically for ESOL educators, but also for educators that work with kids, with any kinds of kids, because emotional intelligence is for everybody. We can look at somebody and we never know if that person is having any kind of mental health issue at the time. And finally, because of the pandemic, we are talking about mental health and how mental health affects the students and how mental health affects or is obviously an innate part of every human being. In my case, personally, at my former school, two of my students took their lives, and for them, committing suicide for the other students was obviously very traumatic. And in my case, I was wondering why I didn't see it. Why didn't I notice that these kids were going through really big stuff, you know? So that's what led my research. So well, this came out of time, but anyway, after the pandemic, so we had the worldwide pandemic, the quarantine, politics versus health discussions, and what's going on with COVID-19, etc. Here in the US, we specifically lived the George Floyd situation when he was killed by a police officer, that erupted lots of protests related to social justice, uh, which is translated into looking at racism, looking at inequalities and inequities for different people, etc. And of course, in our case, teachers became the heroes temporarily by working from home, teaching the kids from home. But it also had effects. Effects that translated into, well, what's going to do now? So as I said before, when I was finishing my research, I found out that everybody started talking, seriously talking, because that was a topic that was mentioned, but it was not priority. They started talking about social and emotional learning, which is emotional intelligence, and to me is basically called emotion education. And although I didn't include that as a big topic in my research, I found the connection between emotion education and equity. So I started researching that and what equity is. So what is educational equity? In equity in general, we have seen this little picture of, I forgot to add it to the presentation, but we have seen this little picture probably if you have heard about this topic, and it's three little kids trying to watch a game, and each of them has a box according to their height, right? Like giving the resources for the kids according to the specific needs. But I was always wondering, why are these kids still watching the game, from behind a fence and using different kind of boxes? Isn't it better just to remove the fence for them? You know? So educational equity is the creation and or elimination of policies, systems, and practices in schools. Policies, systems, and practices in schools that impact the experiences, the outcomes, and the access to resources for students from previously excluded groups. And in this case, it's talking about kids who come from poverty, kids who come from trauma, kids who come from specific situations in health, kids who come from other countries, and of course, kids who come from kids with special education or disabilities or differences in learning, kids who are have gender and identity differences, and English learners or multilingual learners. So educational equity is the creation or elimination of these policy systems and practices in schools. That those elements that impact the experiences, outcomes, and access to resources of these students. But as a teacher, how can I change a policy, right? Or a system or a practice? All of us have the opportunity to be at a school committee that makes decisions. So what is the thing? This is Dr. Fields the third. I will show you the book that he wrote about it. I will try to give you a little, if you're interested in this topic, I will try to give you a little bit of resources in case you want to access them. Anyway, he basically said that educational equity is action, unapologetically action, to remove those barriers the kids have. But again, as a teacher, what can I do? This is his book, How to Achieve Educational Equity. It was published this year. So again, how? And he basically mentions these steps. And this was my favorite part, at your current level. Because again, we are not leaders at schools. Many of us cannot change any kind of system or policy. So what can we do? He first of all he said, okay, am I being complicit in educational inequities? And I will take the liberty of responding for everybody and say, yes, I am being complicit. I have been complicit because I have my own biases, right? I am specifically Latina in the US. I didn't know what Hispanic meant when I came to the United States. Hispanic is related to race, and implicitly it meant different kinds of discrimination and racist attitudes towards me and my children. And And I'm not complaining, it's basically the reality. Especially when I was a minority teacher at a school that was mostly African American, it was very interesting. It was a very marvelous, outstanding learning experience, but it doesn't mean it was easy all the time. So, am I being complicit in educational inequities? Yes I have. And yes, I probably am. Have I been the best teacher for students with disabilities? Have I been the best educator for students who think differently from me or who have certain reactions towards my strategies in class? What triggers me as an educator? So, after I identify educational inequities, because sometimes we have our favorite kind of students, right? And as humans, we have those kinds of students who uh, we don't like that much. And maybe we try to be the best teacher, but inside there, our hearts, inner, very deep there, we may have those kinds of feelings. So we need to be very upfront, and this is what is going on with talking about social justice in the American environment in general, and it's let's talk about it. It's very difficult to confront situations that are unfair if we are not able to talk about them, and if we are not able to be uncomfortable, uh, analyze ourselves, and be really those people our students need. So, after identifying them, of course, we need to challenge the existing barriers in order to improve the different systems, policies, or practices that we have in our classes. We need to put equity that is superficial and trash, like basically telling lies to ourselves and saying, okay, yeah, I love all my students. What does love mean? Through my learning practice, my teaching practice, my learning practice as an educator, my learning of the students, what is it? What is equity that is really deep? He mentioned wash your hands, and I love this. Wash is actually an acronym, and he works about it basically means work for the W, anticipate for the A, S means strengthen, and H means help. So, yes, wash your hands, keep working hard, anticipate the issues that will be showing up in our classes, strengthen the practices. It means, to me, it means let's keep learning, let's keep talking, let's collectively be the kind of educators our students need based on the specific needs every school has. Because as I mentioned before, I learned the big difference between an inner city school and a rural school. That was my second school at in North Carolina, and now I moved to an urban school that is the second newest school in the area, that serves more than 2,800 students, where about 150 are English learners specifically, where only 40 of those kids are really new students. Most of the other students are basically first generation whose parents don't speak English, but the kids do. So, working on identifying the kids, really learning about them, anticipating the issues, is strengthening our skills as educators, looking and asking for help, and making sure the kids get our help. So, that took me to go back to the topic that is one of my favorite topics ever, which is culturally responsive teaching and learning. And I will guide my presentation on this beautiful book that is Cultural Responsive Teaching and the Brain by Zarira Hammond. She defines cultural responsive teaching as the educator's ability to recognize students as cultural displays of learning and meaning making. Okay, so the ability an educator has to recognize the way the students display their culture, display their learning, and display the ability to make sense of whatever they are learning, and the ability of the teacher to respond positively and constructively with teaching moves that use cultural knowledge as a scaffold to connect what the students know to new concepts and content in order to promote effective information processing. Okay, that's long, right? So the ability of the teacher to respond in a positive and constructive way to the cultural approaches and qualities the students have, and being the ability of the teacher to connect by scaffolding, by putting elements by elements. Little scaffold is what construction workers use, like for example, to paint, the walls or whatever. So to scaffold that knowledge in a way that the students connect to it. They connect to new concepts, they connect to new content, and the ability of the teacher to make this a learning and in a educational environment in a way that promotes effective information processing. All the while, the educator understands the importance of being in relationship. So research has found that the biggest element for success in education is the teacher. Probably the second biggest element is high expectations of the teachers for the students. Are we teaching the minimal stuff, just the basics? Are we challenging the kids in a very, very big way, the way they need to be challenged? So how do we do that if we don't have a relationship with the students? And how we do that if we don't have an emotional connection to them, a social connection to them, if we don't understand what they're coming from, what they mean by their behaviors, not only their words, by their attitudes, and creating a safe space for learning for them. So this is a huge task to face. That is the book. It was published in 2015. So, Zarira Hammond, she obviously makes the difference by talking about the students who are challenged culturally. She's talking about students who need more help from the teacher or less help from the teacher. Let's concentrate on the dependent learner, because the dependent learner, of course, needs the teacher in a very, very, very big way, especially for the cognitive load that needs to be handled in the class. The dependent learner is unsure of how to tackle a new task. The dependent learner cannot complete a task without scaffolds. The dependent learner will sit passively and wait, if stuck, until the teacher intervenes. The dependent learner doesn't retain information well or doesn't get it. The independent learner is the opposite of this. The independent learner can carry his or her own weight of information, knowledge, and evidence or outcomes of that learning, right? When we talk about culturally responsive teaching or the cultural responsive teacher, we're talking about that teacher that really understands where the student is coming from, especially if the student is a dependent learner. Uh, she added she adds to the definition this little expression. Excuse me. She adds this little expression to the definition. A cultural responsive teaching is a pedagogical approach firmly rooted in learning theory and cognitive science. So, how do we know if the students are really served in a culturally responsive way? We need to pay attention to, of course, the brains. This is the framework that she created years before she published the book, and she basically talks about being aware of the students' a culture. There is a big tendency in education to look at the students by their deficits, right? Um, for example, for English learners or multilingual learners, there is an expression that is LEP, limited English proficient student, limited. We look at the deficits in a bigger way. This student is low performing, this student is challenged, this student is. So looking at the cultural part is identifying those elements in the student. Also, we need to make sure that we pay attention to partnerships, the learning partnerships. In this case, is mainly the relationship between teacher student, and the importance of social emotional stress in learning. I have always believed that if I cannot learn if I don't want to. There is that implicit connection between brain and heart for learning, and that's kind of like the description of social emotional learning, right? But also we need to know the way the students process information and the community that surrounds the students. So right now we're going to pay attention to the intellective capacity, because I believe that um, educators, we're really good at our content. We are ethically wonderful. We really are the heroes. The pandemic gave us that title for a while, right? Teachers, the educators, the heroes. They are teaching from home, and in spite of having their own families there, etc. Yes, we are those heroes, but sometimes we prioritize the content over the kids, over our learners. And unfortunately, at this moment, not only after the pandemic, but with all the social situations around the world, uh, young people are going through a delicate time of mental health issues. And we know that that is happening, and we haven't been able to address it. And maybe the biggest community students have are their classrooms. And we are supposed, expected to help kids process that. But we need to learn about it. That's it, right? Okay, intellectual capacity is the increased power the brain creates to process complex information more effectively. Um, Talking about, I wanted to add something about numbers, but then I decided not to do it, so I removed that part. But talking about the brain, And excuse me if there are any science teachers, educators present here. I will try to, from my limited knowledge of this, I will try to show what Mrs. Hammond was trying to communicate in the book. So we have three parts of in our brain. They are the three elements of the three functions of the limbic brain. We have the part in the inner brain, the most profound part of our brain is the reticular activating system. It's always on, is the one that tells us about smell in the house if we are sleeping, or that brings the noise of that's when the students are doing something they're not supposed to do. So because we are there, it's always on. Then we have the amygdala, and we know the amygdala is a little tiny thing, not bigger than a mamon, right? An almond is described in this way here as the size of an almond, and it's the part of the body that tells us, or a part of the brain that tells us, hey, fight. There is this situation, flight, run away, freeze, or appease what's going on around us for our safety. And we, of course, include this in our classes. And this is our biggest antagonist in the classrooms when we talk about behavior, right? And finally, we have the hippocampus, which includes the working memory, is where everything in learning happens. And the working memory shrinks when the amygdala is triggered. And this is huge. Although the amygdala it's interesting to see that such a tiny part of our brain is the one that causes disruption of learning, impulsivity, and many other attitudes we want the kids to learn to control and to manage, right? So every time the amygdala reacts, we make our memory basically disappear, get off the picture. It gets off the picture. And our ultimate goal as cultural responsive teachers is to help dependent learners learn to learn by understanding how the brain works initially, right? That's our first part. So when we talk about neuroscience of information processing, or how the brain processes information, we need to look at the three stages. The first one, and the three stages, and also the instructional strategy. So this is kind of like the ideas for us as teachers and as educators, and what to do with the students. I know I'm running out of time. So there are three stages of information processing. Of course, the first part is the input, the second stage is the elaboration, and then the application. And all of those stages or elements are connected to, of course, culture. What is culture? I haven't defined it, right? Culture is everything that we use to manifest, or who we are. It's everything that makes us us. Our language, our view of the world, our traditions, our ancestry, our ways to do stuff, our beliefs, everything. Everything is culture. And if we are able to connect the students' culture in a positive way in the classroom, we're able to help them transform their futures. So, culturally responsive information processing techniques grow out of the learning traditions of oral cultures where knowledge is taught and processed through story, song, movement, repetitious chants, and rituals, and of course, dialogic talk, right? And again, that's from Sarita's Hammond's book. So this definition here is telling us don't start with don't start your classes with a big math exercise yet. Don't start our classes, with something that is too academic. We first of all need to ignite the brain to pay attention. The way we process information is attached to our most traditional learning capacities, and they have to be with the oral language because that's the way we learn initially, right? So there are 4 levels of instructional strategies that we can use in our classes that respond to a cultural skills in the students or abilities, and they support the development of their intellective capacity. So the first step or the first strategy is, and this is kind of like a lesson plan. That's how I see it, kind of like the different steps in lesson planning. The first part is ignite. Is, hey, let's prepare the brain to pay attention through exercises of call and response, through music. The call and response, I just thought about somebody. I remember that there was this Spanish teacher, a coworker, who used this for students, like to pay attention to the class, or whenever she wanted to make students pay attention. And she said she just stood in front of the classroom. She said, "Hey," and the students would respond, "Macarena," and they knew that was the sign. And this is high school, 11th, 12th graders, which are 17, 18 years old here in the US. So something like that, call and response, like giving, it's like when the whistle in the soccer game is blown, right? The whistle is blown and everybody knows that that's the beginning. Some kind of music, some provocations, like questions, like jokes, like little dances, and chatting about something that prepares the brains to be ready. Then the chunk is feeding the brain with little pieces of information, and the rule of thumb here is, for example, 7 words, or is 7 key elements that will be vocabulary is usually the best thing to tackle here. So 7 words, and or maybe practicing 7 words plus something new, right? Something little that is new. The other part is the chew, is the help the brain process the content, is the sometimes we teachers we talk a lot, and we talk for 40 minutes of an hour, right? But the brain will never be, and we get upset if the kids get distracted, but the brain doesn't work that way. The brain needs to, like every engine, right? It starts, it works hard, and then needs some time to process. So 15 to 20 minutes of instruction, and then a 5-7 minute break. So of course we know that we need to change activities, but what kinds of activities we use and for how long? Talk to learn, if we're language teachers, we love Vygotsky. He in education he is huge, but especially because he mentioned that language is social. One of the best, if not the best, strategy to make kids learn is to help them teach other people, is to speak aloud their learning by creating different things. But language is social, especially in cultures like ours that are collectively learning cultures. It's more individualistic here in the US, but we in Colombia are still collective learners. We pay attention to what the 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 other people think, and when we learn from each other very well, using mnemonics like songs or poetry, but mnemonics in rhythm, using storytelling. There is nothing better than working on stories and the students' stories. Using, of course, visuals, graphic organizers, etc., to analyze the information. To if we use, in my case, I teach English 9 specifically. We work with short stories, but short stories could be 4 pages, and just reading the story as a whole is it's crazy. The kids cannot process that information well. Using metaphors and analogies, using creating games, word games, and using humor to process the information. And finally, the review, which is to strengthen neural pathways. So we review through games. We should review by using the situation in real life problems. Many of us talk about a lot about problem solving, learning, or problem based learning, or inquiry based learning, and working on long term projects. So I wanted to add something. I took the note, I didn't add it here. But other 2 elements that are key for creating culturally responsive environments are, of course, the rituals that we design as a community in a classroom, right? And also the opportunities that we give the students to develop their agency and their voice in situations that are social, in situations that are academic, but we need to create and design those structures. I really hope that this it's a helpful for educators, but also for learners. How to, if you are a student, how should you create like a situation, a learning situation or a learning environment for yourself by igniting, creating a special ritual that will make you concentrate on your work, studying the information in little chunks, chewing this information, this content in specific practical ways that make your brain engage into this and make your culture engage into this. It means you yourselves, the whole you, and how to review this information. Okay. I just wanted to end with this. This is my favorite. This is kind of like my education, my philosophy in education. And it's educating the mind without educating the heart is no education at all. It relates to emotion education. It relates to culture. It relates to looking at the assets of the students. It relates to our ability to develop good relationship with the students, even when the students challenge us. And this is a quote that has been attributed to Aristotle, and that's all I have. And I'm sorry, I know it's late. Thank you very much. 2 minutes to 10. Thank you for having me.
Thank you, Mabel, for this interesting talk. I think we all have enjoyed it too much. There are some comments in the chat that I want to read so that you know.
Mhm.
At the beginning, Nancy Carreño said that you were asking about the effects of the pandemic in education.
Positive. Mhm.
Yes, positive effects. And she says that we are stronger, more resilient teachers, and being competent in remote teaching is a good outcome. This is what she mentioned at the beginning. Uh,
May I add something to it? I really think that finally education is kind of at the level of business, you know, because the kids now develop the abilities to survive in the real commercial business areas through technology. And the teachers, we finally had to catch up. And I think that's really important. In spite of the all the difficulties, I think that's really important.
yeah, right. Okay. Professor Payares said that he is afraid that there are more negative effects of the pandemic on education because we are fighting laziness for our students. Have you experienced that?
Oh yeah, I mean, last year we are right now, excuse me, we are right now completely full face to face. But last year we were hybrid. It means we were virtual and then hybrid. It means half of the time the kids would be online and half of the times the kids would be or were face to face. And yes, it definitely was difficult, and that's why I think that this now the culturally responsive teaching and learning, because it implies how we learn and the students learn, is key, because now it's more important than ever that we are able to engage the students into the content and to engage to a new, it's a new world. So it's a new way of teaching. It's a new way of learning, and if we respond to them, trying to help them go navigate through that trauma, we don't know what they lived when they were in their houses. We don't know their experiences. We did have our own traumas. So if we learn about it, if we pay attention to that, and if we pay attention to the ways the brain works, eh, maybe that laziness will work in a different way, you know. But also we need to look at our own biases, and um, because maybe for me learning using music is distracting, but maybe for students it's not, because they were born in a digital era. So it's a lot of digging into what's best for my students, um, and how to be a better educator, of course, but also the paradigms that we had before the pandemic. Yes, they are not responding the same way, but we keep teaching the same way. We cannot do it anymore. We have to restructure our teaching.
Right.
Mhm. And it's a
Professor,
process, because being in person, I mean, yeah, I started teaching at the end of August, and it's almost November, and yeah, I mean, they are getting tired easily. They were used to be in classes for 90 minutes in the high school case, and now after 20 minutes they are done. They are like, in the last class of the day, they are just like, that's it for me. So how can we re-engage them in a positive way? Because they were used to that computer for 18 months. That's too much.
yes,
Hmm.
certainly it is. Professor Payares also highlights the fact that nobody teaches us emotional intelligence, and we are dealing with that part, and maybe something that has affected us, all of us, uh, uh, really in a really huge way.
Hmm.
And he says that nobody is concerned about the teaching emotional intelligence, especially to teachers. No, we are dealing with students, but sometimes we don't know how to deal with our own emotions, and this is something that you have mentioned in your talk, no, Mabel?
Yes, I really think that that is key because we know, right? Kids come from other classes and they mention stuff. This teacher does this and you don't do it, or you know what this teacher did, whatever. This teacher got upset because of this. We all have our own triggers. That's it. We all for some teachers, chewing gum is good. It's okay. For other teachers, is like, wow, the biggest sin ever, right? So if we are not able to process our own emotions and how to deal with that in a class, we are not able to be the mirrors the students need. The students need to be able to, I mean, we are the role models of emotions, and that's the way they learn. And I'm talking about adults in general, but especially in the classes where we are dealing with academic stuff, we really need to be very centered on our own um, abilities and difficulties and challenges. And that's true. And that's what I found that's what I thought when I found that in my research. And is, how can I help a kid who's suffering from post traumatic PS PS PST. What is it? Post stress traumatic
Post-traumatic.
disorder. PSTD. Well, I don't even remember the acronym. Anyway, how can I help a student who has suffered, went through a lot? And I'm talking about here, the US. Uh, how can I help that kind of student so the student is able to pay attention to the class? That is very difficult. But if we talk about Colombia, with all the issues our kids have had, like not having internet, not being able to get out of the house, a house with no food, or we don't know what's happening there. It's going to be difficult to deal with our own emotions if we struggle as teachers too during that time, trying to reach out to the kids with non-responsive parents, etc. I really think that uh, there should be some kind of curriculum for teachers where we are able to explore this, uh, because it's a very difficult area, for us specifically. We cannot teach if we don't know, and we cannot teach the kids to regulate their emotions, which is the biggest part of life, because
Yes.
emotions control us. So how can we teach them if we don't know? That's true.
Yes.
Mhm.
Okay. Right.
Mhm.
Well, and all the participants are very grateful about the conference, about the talk. You have gone through very important concepts for our daily practice. Thank you very much for sharing your knowledge with us, Mabel. Thank you very much for accepting the invitation, and we hope we can have you here again in this space.
Anytime. Yes, thank you so much for having me. As an immigrant here, uh, you miss a lot, and trying to give a little bit of my Colombian and Bumanguesa love back. It's great. So I appreciate that you invited me, and thank you very much for joining me today. I hope it was helpful.
Yes, it certainly was.
Thank you so much.
Okay. Have a very good day,
You too.
and right. Bye bye. See you around.
See you. Bye. Thank
Bye.
you.
All right.
El mundo puede detenerse. Tus sueños no. Elige bien. Elige UPB.